that saved and saved the wretch like me. And I was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. And I was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see.
Have you ever just paused and just thought about grace? I mean, grace is amazing. Grace is irresistible. Grace is the very thing that causes us to be curious and kind of lean in. Grace is, I think, what we all want. Regardless if you're a Christian or not, I think every single one of us, we so desire grace. And when you think about grace and what it really means, I'm just telling you, it's beautiful. And it's amazing. And as we think about grace, you know, grace is the opposite of karma. Karma is getting what you deserve, like it's going to catch you. I did this wrong thing and it's going to get me. It's going to get me someday, some way. No, grace is radically different than karma. See, grace is getting what you don't deserve and not getting what you do deserve. And that's why I say it's the thing I think every single one of us want, regardless if you're a Christian or not, regardless of where you're at in terms of religious or not. We all want grace. And do you know when we want grace the most? Do you know when you want grace the most in your life? It's during these times. It's what we crave the most when our guilt's exposed. Isn't that true? Like when you're caught and you're busted and you are like, hey, you're exposed and here it is. Here's your guilt. Isn't it the very thing that we want in those moments is grace? I think about the time I was 10 years old. You know, as a little boy, one of my favorite games of all time was a game called Pac-Man. Anybody like Pac-Man way back in the day? Yeah. I mean, I love that game, and I would do whatever I could to play it. And during, you know, when I was 10, the place I played Pac-Man was down at the convenience store about a block away from my house. It was called Zippy's. And I would go down to Zippy's, and I would play Pac-Man all the time, and I would get so excited, and I'd get closer to the high score. But the problem is I was running out of money. But here's what I knew. I knew my dad had a coin collection. And in his coin collection, he had multiple silver dollars. And so what I would do is I would go into the room, I would sneak these silver dollars, I'd bring this silver dollar down to Zippy, and then I would give it to the cashier, and I'd say, hey, can I get 4 quarters? And every time I gave him that silver dollar, I mean, the individual smiled, and I was like, they're the happiest people of all time. It's amazing. And they would give me those 4 quarters, and I would play Pac-Man and try to get the, you know, the record, you know, score. And I would do that over and over and over until the day my dad said, Bucko, can you come into our room? And I walked into his room. He pulled out his coin collection, and he said, what's happened to my silver dollars? And as a 10-year-old little boy, I promise you in that moment, I was like, Dad, the thing I want the most from you is grace. I think every little boy and every little girl, every son and every daughter desires grace. And that's really one of the reasons why Jill and I, my beautiful wife and I, with our 5 boys, we've created what we call the Place of Grace. And the place of grace in our home, it's the safest place in the world to tell us anything. It's the safest place in the world for our 5 sons to say, here's what happened, here's what I did, without fear of consequence. There's no consequence in the place of grace. And you may hear that and you may go, well, Buck, that's risky. Like, I mean, what about justice? What about consequences? How do you teach your kids that? Well, if you hang around our home just for one day with 5 sons, they do plenty of things wrong. And I see them all the time. And I'm like, okay, you need to not talk to your mom this way, or quit, choking your brother, and, all these kind. It happens all the time. They're very familiar with consequences and discipline. But I'm telling you, it's the things I don't see. It's when they go to school, or when they're with their friends, or when they're at that certain party, and they cross that certain line and they do that certain thing. And because their fear of a consequence, because their fear of looking into my eyes or into Jill's eyes, they keep it to themselves and they carry it alone. And I don't want my sons to carry those things alone. And so one of the things Jill and I have done, and it is a risk, we've said, boys, the safest place in the world for you to tell us absolutely anything without fear of consequence is the place of grace. I think every son and daughter desires that. But see, grace has a flip side. It's interesting. It's a thing we want the most when our guilt's exposed, but isn't this also true? It's what we're hesitant to extend when confronted with the guilt of others. When somebody hurts us, or even more than that, when somebody hurts somebody that we love, isn't it true that the tension is the last thing we want to give them is grace? We want to give them justice, and here's what you deserve, and I can't believe you did that. And that's the dilemma when it comes to grace. See, when it comes to grace and we receive grace, it's so refreshing and wonderful and amazing. But when grace is required of you and grace is required of me, it's incredibly disturbing, isn't it? And that's the tension with grace. And so, guys, here's the deal. When you think about grace, when we think about grace, when you think about your relationships and your life and your marriage and your kids or your mom and dad or your boyfriend or girlfriend, when you think about meaning and purpose, when you think about God, here's what we're going to talk about throughout this series, is that grace, it's the unsettling solution for just about everything. And today what I want to do is I just want to unpack what grace is to give us all a firm, consistent understanding about grace and how it is amazing. And then over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about what does grace actually mean to you? And what does grace mean to your relationships, in your marriage relationships, in your dating relationships, in your parenting relationships? And what does grace mean between you and God? And we're going to talk about all of that. But for today, I just want to unpack this big idea and explain to you as to why it's so incredibly amazing. And so as we think about grace, I just want to give us a working definition. That way we're all on the same page. You see, when it comes to grace, I would define grace as this, is it's undeserved, unearned, unearnable favor. That's grace. And grace happens exclusively in relationships. Can't happen outside of it. It is extraordinarily personal. And the minute you think you deserve grace, the minute you say, yeah, me, look at what I've done, I deserve grace, by definition, it is no longer grace because you can't earn grace. When it comes to grace, you can beg for it. When it comes to grace, you can ask for it. When it comes to grace, you can plead for it. But you cannot earn it. It's undeserved, unearned, unearnable favor. And the reason why we're talking about grace, especially with Christmas coming up just over 3 weeks away, which is just wild to think about. But the reason we're talking about this in Christmas is because of this. We would have never known the grace of God without the presence of God. See, when Jesus came into the world during Christmas, that's what Christmas is all about, he personified grace. When Jesus came in the world, he made grace so relational. When Jesus came into the world, grace was very, very, very real and irresistible. In fact, the Apostle John, Jesus' closest follower, the Apostle John, Jesus, the one that stood at the cross, and Jesus looked at, John, his closest friend. He said, John, take care of my mom. And John, by all historical accounts, took care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. In fact, today you can go to the city of Ephesus where John took care of Mary, and you can visit the very location, the very home that John took care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. That's John. John, when he wrote a letter about the life of Jesus, started his letter this way. Look at this. He said these words. He said, the word, that means God, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That the Word came into this world, that the Word took on flesh, that the Word was known from the lips of prophets and written on tablets of stone, but now it came in the form of a person. And the person, his name is Jesus Christ. And our question to John at this point is, John, are you saying that Jesus is God in a body? And John would say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Well, John, how can you explain that? How is that even possible that God came down to be with us, Jesus called Emmanuel, God with us? How's that even possible? And I think John would say to you and to me, he would say, well, I can't fully explain that. Trying to explain an infinite, uncaused, perfect, holy God and how he came among us and walked among us and taught us. I don't know if a finite person like myself can explain that infinite context, but I'm just telling you, he is God in a body. And he continues and tells us why he says that. He says, because, listen, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. In other words, John says, guys, I've been on the other side of him. Like I ate with him, I talked with him, I asked him a myriad of questions. I watched him defy the laws of physics. You can't explain it. And the only explanation on the other side of Jesus Christ is he is God in a body. And if I had to describe Jesus, John would say, I would describe him in two words, grace and truth. Not the balance of grace and truth, because anytime you try to balance grace and truth, you diminish one or the other. No, this is full grace and full truth, 100%. And when you and I hear this, oftentimes we go, well, that's a hard concept to get. You mean 100% grace and 100% truth, not the balance of? And the reason why that's hard for us, or one of the reasons why that's hard for us to wrap our minds around, is because perhaps the context, your context, my context. Because if you grew up in a home of truth where it's all about the truth and nothing but the truth, and it's very legalistic and ritualistic, and you will do the truth, and what's the truth, and it's always being disciplined around the truth, or if you grew up in a truth church where it's all about the truth and nothing but the truth, and we're going to kick you out because you don't adhere to the truth, it's all about the truth. What did you long for in those environments? You longed for grace. But if you grew up in a home or you grew up in a church that was just full of grace, that said, hey, it doesn't matter what you do, when you do, what you say, how you say it. There's just no consequence. There's no lines. There's no right or wrong. Just do whatever you want to. Isn't it true if you grew up in that kind of home or that kind of church, isn't it true that you long for truth? And because of our context, when we hear about Jesus being 100% truth and 100% grace, it's very difficult to wrap our minds around. But John is telling you and teaching me. He's saying, hey, listen, Jesus never watered down the truth or turned down grace. Jesus called sin, sin, and then he gave his life for the sinner. And what John would summarize, if you will, when it came to the life of Jesus, he would just say, hey, Jesus was all grace and all truth, all the time. And there's so many examples of this in the life of Jesus. I mean, when you think about just the life of Jesus, you could just pick myriads of example after example after example. For example, on one occasion when Jesus, early on in his ministry, Jesus was recruiting his 12 disciples, and he had Peter and John and James and Philip and Nathaniel, the guys. And so just a few of the disciples were with Jesus, and early on, they were walking across this river, then they crossed this bridge, and anytime you crossed a bridge in the first century, you always saw the table. And at that table, there was always a tax collector, because that's how it worked in the first century. And so Jesus, early on in his ministry, and just a few of his guys, they walk across this bridge, they see that table, and Jesus walks up to the tax collector table with a man named Matthew and says, Matthew, follow me. Now, guys, I don't know if this is true, but based upon all historical accounts and all the research I've done, this is perhaps the first time in recorded history a rabbi has ever approached a tax collector and not told him what he's done wrong and how bad he is, but is asking a tax collector to come follow him. Because in the first century, tax collectors were as bad as you could imagine. Tax collectors were at the bottom of the barrel. Tax collectors had betrayed their Jewish brothers and sisters and turned their backs on them. And tax collectors had betrayed the nation of Israel and the God of Israel and sided with Rome and the Roman Empire. They were despised and hated in the first century. But that didn't bother Jesus, because perhaps the first time in human history a rabbi, Jesus, walks up to Matthew. He says, Matthew, come on. I see who you are. I see all you've done. I see your good and your bad. It doesn't bother me. Come on, follow me. Matthew gets up and comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, where are we going? I mean, this is historic. Where do you want to go? And Jesus says to Matthew, I want to go to your house. I want to have a meal at your house, and I want you to invite all your tax collector friends, and I want you to invite all your sinner friends. And I want to eat with you, which in the first century, if you ate with somebody, you affirmed their life. You said they have value. You said publicly to everybody around, they are my friend, and they have significance. Imagine that in the first century. A rabbi doing this with the most despised individual, a tax collector. But Jesus went and he ate with Matthew, his tax collector friends, and the sinner friends. And I'm just telling you, when Jesus walked in that room and they started eating the meal, I can almost guarantee it was awkward. It was weird. It was unsettling. And the reason I say that is because in my line of work, in my profession, when I tell people I'm a pastor, oftentimes it just gets really weird in that moment. For example, I play golf, and one of the things I'll do is I'll go to the golf course and play, and, there's random guys they pair you up with, and I'll get paired up with a foursome, and I'll play the first 4 or 5 or 6 holes, and then all of a sudden the question is always asked, hey, Buck, what do you do? And I go, here it goes. I'm a pastor. I'm a pastor of this church called North Point. You heard of it, and we get in that dialogue, and as soon as I say that, it's almost like the eyes get big, and the individual goes, oh. And then all of a sudden, a couple holes later, he hits a bad shot, and he yells out, out loud. I hear him go, Jimmy the Cricket. And I'm like, what did you say? That's certainly not what you said on hole number 2. And all of a sudden, it just gets awkward. And a couple holes later, confession happens, and they'll come up to me, hey, Buck, what I said on 2. I just want to let you know, I know you're pastor. Didn't know that, but now I do. It's weird. Now, I'm not comparing myself to Jesus at all, but imagine this. The Son of the living God, Jesus, a rabbi in the first century, walks into a home with the most despised, the worst of the worst individuals in that culture. You have to know it was awkward. But Jesus was incredibly, incredibly comfortable, even though they were radically different than him. And everybody's watching this. And everybody's got questions. And one of the groups who has questions are the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees. And in fact, here's their question. When the Pharisees saw this, they were shocked. And they asked his disciples, why? Because anytime grace is demonstrated, you always ask why. Because it makes no sense. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? We're the holy ones. We're the ones who do the will of God. Why doesn't he spend time with us? Why does he spend time and focus his energy and effort on people who are nothing like him? Why is this grace being demonstrated? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus responds to this question. And Jesus says, on hearing this, Jesus said, don't call Matthew and his friends sinners. That hurts their feelings. If you hurt their feelings, they may raise your taxes. So be careful with what we say. We don't want to hurt their feelings, right? That's not what Jesus said, did he? No. See, Jesus is brilliant. And Jesus just demonstrated incredible grace by going public with the worst of the worst people and calling them his friends. And then he says in response, on hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need the doctor, but the sick. Imagine this scene. Matthew and his buddies and the sinners, right? They could have looked at Jesus and said, are you calling me sick? Do you know how offensive that is? How dare you call me sick? Who do you think you are, Jesus? But see, we learn a very valuable lesson, and maybe this is the reason you're here. Maybe this is the biggest takeaway from today for your personal life and for your relationships. One of the lessons we learn in this moment is oftentimes grace creates a pathway for truth. Isn't that true? It's like Jesus, before anything else, demonstrated grace. Nobody in human history had demonstrated like a rabbi, had demonstrated this kind of grace with tax collectors and sinners. And these tax collectors and sinners, they knew that Jesus cared about them. They knew that Jesus had gone public, affirming their value and worth. And so when Jesus said, you guys are sick. I'm here for you. You're sick. There's sin in your lives. It wasn't offensive. In fact, I think, according to the scriptures, they were actually able to hear it. and listen to the words of Jesus. Why? Because grace oftentimes creates a pathway for truth. And all too often we're about, well, he needs to change. Well, they need to change. Well, my son, my daughter, well, my wife, my husband, well, my boss, and we pick out all the truth elements and we want to tell people truth right away. But one of the things we learned from Jesus is, oh my gosh, he was 100% grace and 100% truth. And grace oftentimes creates the pathway for people to hear truth. Grace and truth. Another example of this is one day early in the morning, Jesus did what Jesus often did. He went to the temple, and he goes to the temple, and the sun is just rising. Imagine this scene in this beautiful, extravagant temple. And he starts teaching, and he's teaching like no one's ever taught, so the crowds begin to come, and they're surrounding Jesus, and they're growing, and all of a sudden, he sees this kind of unsettled, commotion over here in the crowds, and he sees the religious leaders, and the religious leaders are dragging this woman who's half clothed. Imagine that early in the morning. And everything pauses and everything stops. And the religious leaders called the Pharisees say to Jesus, "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. Truth. The law of Moses says stone her." Jesus, what are you going to do? You know the truth. What are you going to do? Jesus was a brilliant and a master communicator. Said, okay, I'll play your game. Because it was a game, because they should have brought the man as well, but they didn't according to the law. They just brought the woman. And Jesus knew what they were up to. So he says, fine, let's do it. Let's go ahead and stone her. In fact, this is the way Jesus says it. He says, go for it. Let any one of you who's without sin be the first to throw the stone at her. Go ahead, fulfill truth. But if you've ever sinned, don't you dare pick up that rock. One by one, they walk away, starting with the old and then finally the young. And all that's left is Jesus, because he's the only one who could stone her. He's the only one who could condemn her. He was sinless. And what did he do in all of his holiness and all of his power? What did he do in that moment? He said to the woman, I don't condemn you. Now, if you just detach from that just a second and think about this scene, you really want to push against this because you want to go, Jesus, how could you? Don't you know what she did to her husband? Don't you know what she did to her kids? Don't you know how severe, adultery and how it makes life so much more complex? Don't you know, what about justice? What about consequences? Who would ever say, I don't condemn you? Do you know who would say that in the midst of this kind of sin? Do you know who would say that? Grace would say that. That's exactly what Jesus did. But then the very next thing he says, go. Now leave your life of sin. Truth. Sin is making your life so much more complicated. Sin is robbing the intimacy from your marriage, and you know it. Now go. Leave your life of sin. You see, Jesus says, you are guilty, but I don't condemn you. Grace and truth. And perhaps the greatest example of Jesus' grace on full display. In fact, perhaps the greatest example in the life of Jesus where he actually put amazing grace on the map was at the cross of Jesus Christ. Because at the end of his life, when he was hanging on a Roman cross, he was hung between two men, and these two men were criminals. And one of the criminals, as he was hanging on the cross, looks at Jesus and begins to mock Jesus and say, Jesus, if you're the Son of God, that's the word on the street about you. If you're the Messiah, then save yourself. And he mocks Jesus. But then the other criminal on the other side of Jesus, the other criminal rebuked him. And the other criminal is going, what are you saying? In fact, the other criminal says to the one who just mocked Jesus, he says, don't you fear God? He said, don't you fear God? And the context that we don't get in this passage, but so important to understand, is that when you're hung on a Roman cross, it is almost impossible to speak. It is so painful to speak because the Roman cross is all about suffocation. And to get air in your lungs to speak, you had to push yourself up to get air in your lungs. It was extraordinarily painful. And maybe you could say one or two words. This probably took the criminal about 5 minutes to say to Jesus. But we're going to read it in a few seconds, but that context is important. And he says, to the criminal. He says, don't you fear God? He said, since you are under the same sentence, we're punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man, Jesus, he's done nothing wrong. In other words, we're guilty. He's not. He's holy. We're not. And if a good person is going to get into heaven, it's certainly Jesus. If a holy person is going to get into heaven, it's certainly Jesus, which means there is no chance of us getting into heaven. And then the criminal asked Jesus to do for him something perhaps the criminal had never done for anyone else. The criminal then says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, when you come into heaven. Jesus, would you extend grace in this moment and allow me to go to heaven with you, in essence? And imagine standing in the crowd. I guarantee the religious leaders laughed and mocked this. Are you kidding me? You got 30 minutes to live. What are you going to do in those 30 minutes to get into heaven? How are you going to earn that? How are you going to live a good enough life? How are you going to make up for all the bad stuff you've ever done? You're hanging on a cross because you are guilty. Really? You think Jesus is going to let you into heaven? Are you kidding me? And look at this. Jesus answered him. Let me pause and just ask you a quick question. Does God listen to the prayer of sinners? Does God listen to the prayer of sinners? Yes, because that's the only kind of prayers there are. And the criminal says, will you allow me to go to heaven? And Jesus answered him and said, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. How could this be? This man was guilty. This man perhaps hurt people his whole life. He had sinned his whole life. Now you're telling me, in this little exchange of a conversation, he's going to go to heaven? Who would ever do that? Do you know what would do that and who would do that? Jesus, as he displayed amazing grace. Now, when you think about grace, oftentimes there's a question that comes up. And when I have conversations about grace, people go, well, grace, that sounds amazing. Like, I desire that in my life. But what's the difference between like grace and this idea of mercy and forgiveness? Are these all pretty much the same thing? Isn't mercy like grace? Isn't forgiveness like grace? Aren't these all pretty much the same? Well, guys, these are very, very different. And today, I just want to explain and answer this question of what's the difference between mercy, forgiveness, and grace. And to do that, and really to illustrate that, I want to ask our stage manager, Mark, and Tanner to bring out certain things. So you're about to see what they're about to bring out. It is a fancy bicycle right here. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to use your imagination real quick with me. And the first part is I want you to use your imagination that I actually ride this thing, right? Because you can kind of tell, like, hey, bikes, Buck, I don't think you ride it much. Anyways, but this is not my bike. But imagine if it was. And imagine if I rode this all the time and I rode it up in the mountains and you can see the dust on it and it's all dusty. And then imagine this. Imagine you and I are in my garage. And I'm talking about this bike and showing you my cool bike and I ride it all the time and, man, I love it. And then you ask me the question, well, how much is this bike? And I said, well, this is a $7,000 bike. And legit, this is a $7,000 bike. You don't have to imagine that. This is crazy. Now, again, it's not my bike, but imagine if it was. And so we're having this conversation. You're like, that's a $7,000 bike? Yeah, it's a $7,000 bike. And then I respond to you. I go, hey, you could actually sell this for about $5,000 today. And you're like, wow. And then I walk inside because I got some things to do. And all of a sudden, you feel the temptation come over you. And you're like, man, I would like that bike. I wonder if I can take that bike. And then imagine, and you have to use this imagination because you would never do this. You take the bike, you steal it, and you're riding down the road, but the seat is so high and it's so awkward that a police officer sees you and pulls you over and says, hey, this doesn't look like, these two things go together. Who's this bike? And one thing leads to another, and he finds out you stole the bike. And then he brings you back to my house, and now you and I are standing in my garage, and I just discovered you stole my bike. Well, in that moment, mercy is the idea to say, hey, you stole something over $1,500 in the state of Texas, that's a felony, and you go to jail. And I'm going to have mercy on you. I'm not going to press charges. You don't have to spend any jail time, but you and I are done. Because for you to steal my bike, You've betrayed my trust. We're done relationally. That's mercy. You don't go to jail. Forgiveness is the idea, hey, I'm not going to press charges. You're not going to jail. And by the way, we're all broken, aren't we? We all mess up. I get you messed up. I get it. And hey, I'm canceling the debt. You don't owe me. I have forgiven you. Let's go get a cup of coffee. Relationally, we're good. That's forgiveness. Grace is the idea to say, hey, I'm not pressing charges. You're not going to jail. You and I are relationally good. And oh, by the way, it's clear to me you want this bike. So go ahead. Take the bike. I'm gifting it to you. And not only that, but I'm going to gift you a new pair of shoes because your feet and my feet aren't the same size. So I've already ordered a new pair of shoes. I ordered a bike helmet. It's a perfect bike helmet for this kind of bike. I ordered this digital thing that goes here for you. It's awesome. And by the way, I know there are rainy days, so I've already ordered you a Peloton bike with a subscription. I mean, you know those things are like all those commercials. You got one. This is my gift to you. And in addition to that, I know you like Starbucks. So here's a $5 Starbucks card. Here you go. Oops. You okay? That's good. Now, if all of that, use your imagination. If all of that just happened and you were on the other side of that, you would go, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I broke the law. And you've forgiven me? Relationally, we're really good. And I broke the law, and now you're rewarding me with this expensive bike and another expensive Peloton thing, and why would you do that? That is grace. And that's why it's amazing, and that's exactly what Christianity is all about. That's what Jesus Christ did for you and did for me. That's why when Jesus came into the world and Christmas, it's all about this thing called the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, you hear that and you go, well, Buck, that's great. That's a cute little example and all that kind of stuff. But my pushback is this. What about justice? What about consequences? Does this just mean we can do whatever we want? No big deal. Hey, there's never any justice. There's never any consequences. Let me just ask you a question. Who understood justice and consequences of God more than anyone else? You know who? Jesus. I mean, Jesus knew better than anyone about justice and consequences. He knew about eternity. He knew that God's justice is real. He knew that every single sin must be paid for. And he knew that it would crush you, the consequences of your sin and mine. And so what did he do? He said, oh, I see you, and I see you, and I see you, and I see all of you. And oh, how I love you. And he came into this world to live a perfect life. Why? So he could be a perfect sacrifice. Why? So he could satisfy the perfect justice and consequences of God for your sin and for mine. And so we could experience mercy, forgiveness, and God's amazing grace. Jesus knew that. He knew about justice. He knew about consequences. And Jesus also knew that every sin has a gotcha. You see, every time you sin, there's a built-in consequence. And it makes life way more complicated. It makes marriage way more complicated than it needs to be. It makes parenting and looking at your son and looking at your daughter and being able to respond, not react. Sin makes that whole thing so much more complicated. It makes it more complicated for you to look at yourself in the mirror and really see who you are through the eyes of your Heavenly Father. Sin has a built-in consequence, every one. And Jesus knew that. But Jesus came to get you. And he loves you. And he's for you. And he came to display amazing grace. And do you know what the invitation of grace is? Do you know what grace extends to you and to me? The invitation of grace is, hey, I see you. I see all of you. I see your secrets. I see what's public. I see what's private. I see every single one of your mess ups, and I see every single one of your successes. And oh, how I love you. And my invitation to you is to come follow me. Come follow me. But you must be warned. If you choose to follow me, Jesus would say, through grace, I'm going to lead you away from your life of sin because it's hurting you. So come, follow me. Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year because the good news of Christmas is all about a person named Jesus Christ. And the good news is described in 2 words: amazing grace. So what does this mean for you? What does this mean for me? What does it mean for our relationships, your marriage, your friendships, your dating relationships? Well, we're going to talk about that next week. Let me go ahead and pray for us. Father, thank you for your grace. Thank you that you love us enough to see all of us, the good and the bad, and to lean in our direction through your Son, Jesus Christ. I'm so grateful for that. And Father, today as we just begin to discover and scratch the surface of this whole concept of grace, would you open our eyes and open our minds to what we need to know? And would you allow us to understand grace, your grace in our lives, in brand new and refreshing ways throughout this series? God, we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.